So, first of all, I'd like to say, actually the first thing I should say is that I speak a bit quickly. So if I'm talking too fast for you, please make some kind of sign and I'll slow down. I tend to get quicker as the talk goes on, so please do let me know. I want to say also thank you to Ekaterina and Elena for organizing this wonderful conference. It's always fun to come and meet the Russian linguists and everyone else, of course. So I want to say just an introductory thing about what I'm going to be doing over the past 3 days, over the course of this course. It's important to say this because the title of the course that I gave is something like Typology of Lexical Borrowing. But actually, as we'll see, there are more urgent things to be discussed when we come to talk about language contact-induced change in the context of typology. Now, the field of language contact studies is a huge field, but it exists mainly at two poles. On one hand, we have people who are dealing with individual language contact situations, so people who are working on the, bilingualism between Hill-Mari and Russian, let's say. On the other hand, we have big high-level theories, which people like to argue about. What I'm going to suggest is that there's a very big and systematic gap in language contact research, which has to do with typology, and people like yourselves are in an excellent position to begin to address this gap. Right? So this is kind of going to be the leitmotif of what we're going to be doing for the next 3 days. I call this first talk Targeting the Role of Language Contact in Typological Studies, and we'll see why. So basically the structure is today we're going to talk about some other general issues, and then we're just going to go through case studies. I think we're going to have about 4 or 5 case studies over the course of these 3 days. Okay. And I'm going to try to emphasize the influence of language contact on the lexicon, but from different points of view. It doesn't mean that we won't talk a little bit about phonology and semantics and so on, but the focus will be on the lexicon. All right, so as everyone knows, the effects of language contact are everywhere. I think you can't study language without coming across language contact phenomena. I'll give you an example from my own primary language, which is Hebrew. So, תפסיק לעשות בלגן ותביא את הצ'ימידן יאהבה. What we have here is mostly Hebrew lexemes, but in bold we have Loanword. So balagan, I think some of you will know from Russian, right? In Hebrew it just means to make a mess, to make chaos. Chemidan, do you have this also in Russian? My impression is that it's an older word. It comes evidently ultimately from Persian. Yeah, right? But evidently I think it comes from Persian originally. And it traveled to Hebrew via Slavic languages, probably Russian mostly, right? And Ya'abal, this comes from a totally different language family. This is from Arabic. Ya is a vocative marker. Hebrew doesn't have an inherited one. And Abal is the word for idiot. I think its lexical meaning is mouse, by the way. All right. And if we go through things, we can see all sorts of borrowings of various sorts. And we'll talk a bit later about whether borrowing is really an apt word, but we won't focus on this too much. So Domari, which is an Indo-European language spoken throughout the Middle East, we have huge influence of Arabic. This has been especially studied by Yaron Matlas. So we have things like ba'ad, which means after, right? It comes directly from Arabic. And in Otomi, a language spoken mostly in Mexico, we have borrowed inflectional morphology. So for the word, the kinship term, meaning grandchild, it acquired basically Spanish inflectional morphology, getting O and A for the masculine singular and feminine singular, respectively. Yiddish. Yiddish borrowed the word chaver from Hebrew. It means friend or comrade or something like this. The plural being in Hebrew chaverim, in Yiddish chaverim. But this plural marking also spread to words of the non-Semitic stock of Yiddish, the Germanic stock. So, doktoiden, right? Doktor, doktoiden. Semantics, of course, I won't dwell on this too much today because obviously this is going to be the main topic of Masha's other course. So we find all sorts of borrowings and influences in the domain of semantics, polysemy, and so on. In these Meso-American languages, the word for Behind comes from word for shoulder. This is cross-linguistically marked, but it's very characteristic of Meso-American languages. We find it in the domain of syntax. So if we take the Arabic from Bukhara, where the main contact languages are Tajik and also Turkic languages, we have a reorganization of syntax from being basically VSO with SVO to being SOV, also with an increasingly obligatory marking of objects on the verb, right? So he took a knife, he took it. This is, of course, possible in other varieties of Arabic, but this has become the default in Bukhara, right? Kurmanji. We have a word, Haywan. This is an inherited Indo-European word, nothing special, but under the influence of Arabic, it's acquired also sounds that were previously not found, like ha, and this is found not only in borrowed words, but also in native words. So also the word for hour is sa'i, with an ah, and so on. Now, what I'm going to be suggesting over the course of this course is that all typologists, no matter what they're working on, what they're doing, what they're interested, have to take an interest in language contact, at least in some way. There's no way of getting around it, although the main tradition in typology, the Greenbergian tradition, has done exactly that. It's tried to get around the effects of language contact, which it shouldn't. The reason why typologists have to care about language contact is because language contact can make languages more similar, right? As we've seen before, these languages in contact, whether Arabic and in Bukhara and Tajik, these languages became more similar in terms of their word order and so on. And this can be with regard to nearly every property of language as far as we know. On the other hand, language contact can lead to changes that make languages more different from each other. And since the entire point of typology is to study cross-linguistic diversity and to identify cross-linguistic similarities and differences, we have to care about language contact. So let's take probably the most canonical example of typology, which is basic word order. Right, so everyone, I think, has seen this map based on Matthew Dreyer's work. You don't even have to have the legend in order to know which word orders are where. So what are the blue circles? What basic word orders? SOV. And what is the red circles? SVO. SVO, right? And because you're typologists and you know these things. Now, a major point that I want to make today is that linguists and also typologists tend to theorize about properties of language and their frequency, right? So we see all of these very nice subject initial word orders. We might want to think that there's something inherently good about this. There's some sort of cognitive bias, or specifically linguistic bias to subject initial word order, especially all sorts of functional reasons have been given for this, and so on. But what do we actually know about the history of, let's say, SVO in the languages of the world? Why do you think that there are so many, let's say, red dots in the Pacific? I mean, it's a bit crowded, so you can't see it, but the Pacific is lots of red dots, and also sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, are these places in which universal cognitive preferences just pop up more and more than in other places? Or perhaps there's something event-related, right? So we know in both of these cases that we have a relatively recent spread of languages whose basic word order is SVO in one case, or verb medial if you prefer. In Bantu, for example, which completely spread all over sub-Saharan Africa on one hand, and in the Pacific also we have the Austronesian languages, which also have a preference for SVO, and at least some parts of the Austronesian domain. So, were it not for these events, then probably the cognitive goodness, or whatever it is, of SVO order would be somewhat less impressive. Or, I mean, of course, we could think it's the other way around, that these people were good expanders in space because they had a word order that made them better conquerors and so on. But it's probably related more to technology and agriculture and so on. Okay, so moving on. As I said, we have to care about language contact as a fundamental concern in typology, and there's really no way of getting around it because what typology is about looking for generalizations within cross-linguistic diversity. And we want to know about the sources for this. Now, I'm thinking about a conversation that I had with Masha Politsky this morning, because typically linguists have organized themselves on theoretical fault lines. So formal linguists like UG type explanations, functionalists, like processing ones. I want you to get this out of your mind. I don't know what you've been taught in your home universities, but this is not where linguistics is in the 21st century. There are multiple sources for cross-linguistic diversity, and what as scientists we should be interested in doing is to try to see how these different sources interact and to tease them apart. So there might be domain general cognitive biases or preferences, for example, about processing. They also might be language specific, so there might be some content to universal grammar. There could be specific features of human anatomy. I'll give you an example. Australian languages have a famously strange sound system. They have these kind of long, thin, horizontal systems where they have many places of articulations for obstruents, but they have very few manners of articulation, right? And what Andy Butcher argued a few years ago is this is actually because of inherited selective deafness, which hits certain frequencies, and basically his argument was that this is what shaped the sound systems of Australia. So we might also have things like this. Of course, social and cultural factors. I hope you'll all go to hear Nick Evans. Probably we'll talk about these things. Also environmental factors. These are the kind of things that actually get into journals like Nature and Science, right? When someone says, well, you know, tonal languages, we know there's a bias towards development of tone in humid climates. Some people have made arguments about other aspects of sound systems and so on based on topography and other aspects of geography and so on. And of course, we always have to keep in mind language, completely language external, non-cognitive events of human history. People move around. Sometimes they want to, sometimes they're forced to. Sometimes people come somewhere else because they're interested in trade or conquering or something like this. And all of these things, because they involve human beings, they also involve language, and they also have consequences for the distribution of linguistic properties in the world's languages, which again is the topic of typology. Okay, so just a few words about the place of language contact in language typology. As you all know, the classical Greenbergian approach is to try to get rid of it, to try to nullify it. And how do you do this? You build a balanced sample, right? So you really care about not having all of your languages from the same area, not having your languages from the same family, and so on. And these are balanced or stratified samples. Why? Because languages can be more similar to each other because they inherit in some property or because of language contact. So again, the typical approach has been to get rid of what they call areal biases. And this is a very deep thread in classical Greenbergian typology. But there are some problems with this. And the main problem is that today's population of languages in the world cannot be assumed to be representative of human language in general, right? I mean, we know that there's been massive language extinction in the past 500 years, and some more is projected for the future. And so we can't treat today's current group of languages as really being able to represent the full range of human linguistic diversity. And we know that it's in many of the most vulnerable areas of the world that we find interesting and new and strange rare properties of language, right? Whether in phonology, syntax, semantics, or whatever. So we have to care about this. So as a result, it's been more recently the case with typology that people have been arguing that we have to directly look at inheritance on one hand, genetic affiliation of languages, and language contact in a direct fashion, and not to treat them as confounds to be somehow ironed out. All right, and this of course goes back, I mean, anytime in the history of linguistics you say it goes back to someone, it always goes back further. I'm going to give you just some standard signposts for this. First of all, Matthew Dreyer's work on word order, but afterwards massively by Johanna Bickel, and a little bit more recently by Balthasar Bickel. And in fact, because of these shifts in typology, among them, the conclusion that some linguists have come to that there are no absolute universals and the proper object of study of typology is diversity in its own right, there's been a shift among parts of the typological community to what's been called distributional typology or diversity linguistics more broadly. I'm sorry. And this is very easy to capture because basically what distributional typology is looking at is not necessarily classical Greenbergian universals, but rather answering the question, what's, where, why, and you can add to this when. All right? So what linguistic properties, where are they, why are they there? All right? And the why is actually the search for causal theories. Now, there are two methods. I'm going to talk about just one. You're welcome to read about the other. One is the family bias method, all right? And what it tries to do is it tries to estimate the probabilities of change in a particular direction within a family. And what's important about this is that unlike the classical Greenbergian approach, which is to take one language from Indo-European and one language from Austronesian and so on, what it does is it very densely samples families of languages in order to see, and this connects with what Masha said earlier about lexical typology, in fact, that it's extremely interesting, but not only interesting, it's important to densely sample families, especially when we're looking at things like change, right? So semantic shifts on one hand, but here we're talking about contact-induced change much more broadly. The idea here is that you're looking at families, you're sampling them densely, and you're looking to see if there's a family-wide bias towards change in a particular direction, right? So, I don't know, losing aspiration, gaining aspiration, developing a half-perfect, not developing a half-perfect. Of course, there can be a bias towards acquiring something in a family, a bias towards losing it, or no bias at all, right? You don't see any kind of particular signal. So let's take a very quick look at one example of the use of the family bias method. So two competing causal theories about the apparent association that we see all over Eurasia between a distinctive case marking for A and P core arguments on one hand, and verb final word order on the other, right? So one thing could be, one claim has been that this kind of case marking system is driven by verb final order, right? And you can have all sorts of cognitive explanations or language internal explanations for this. But another kind of explanation has been that this is the result of the way that populations migrated throughout Eurasia, okay, in prehistorical times. Now, you could see this as two competing theories, right? And you'd say, no, my theory is right. I like this, I don't know, head final thing, driving case marking. It's good for my theory. Or you could say, no, I hate formal theories. I want it all to be language contact and event-based. But actually, a responsible scientist would say, hey, let's check it out. And let's use the tools of science, which is statistics, in order to investigate this question. So some terms that are going to come up again are Bickel's distinction between functional. It's used in a somewhat different sense than what you guys might be used to. Theories or factors or triggers, as opposed to event-based factors or theories or triggers. So what are functional triggers? Functional triggers are basically anything that's really universal. So these are things that are grounded in our biology, our cognition, or universal facts about human social structure, to the extent that there are such things, or particular sociolinguistic constellations, right? So for example, given, let's say we find an effect that languages spoken by many speakers tend to do X, let's say this is a sociolinguistic universal, right? So we would expect this to have the same probability in any case of happening. Right. As opposed to event-based triggers or theories or causal factors, which are, again, basically about language contact. These are things that have to do with the contingencies of human history and again, human beings as speakers of languages. Now, this is not a very good dichotomy in some respects, because people who work on language contact will tell you that language contact also has to do with cognition and social structure and so on, but we're going to use this for the sake of today's presentation. So, for example, just to give you an idea of how these two things can play out, we know, it's plausible to think that features like relative pronouns, differential object marking, and half-perfects are somehow not, preferential targets of universal grammar. They're not, there's no bias towards them in our cognition. Why? Because they're actually very rare, except for in certain areas, right? So we know that they started out in some parts of the world, and then they spread, they became fashionable, right? So there's probably no functional bias towards having a half-perfect, But if there is a half-perfect in a dominant language like Latin, it can spread all throughout Europe, right? And this is basically what's happened, as Bridget Drinker and others have shown. Okay, so going back to the issue of word order and case marking. So this is data taken from Autotype. This is one of Bickel's team's experiments. And what we see here, the red circles are languages which have case in this particular sense, that they distinguish A and P arguments in different ways. Right? And so the gray ones are no case, the red ones are with case, right? So we see that there's a slight preference for case systems like this in Eurasia. That's what we see here. Now, what we see here is looking at it, again, at the level of individual families, so densely sampling a bunch of families. And what we see here is the gray is no bias either way. Blue is a bias against case. That means within a given family, most languages either did not develop case or they lost it. And the red is a bias for case, which means that either most languages have it, developed it, or renovated it even after having lost it, right? And so what we see here on the left is anything but verb final, then verb final, and then the two within Eurasia, right? So this is the rest of the world as opposed to Eurasia. And I think that all of you guys can eyeball this and see what is going to be the conclusion, right? So actually the bias for case, as opposed to against case, is determined by both these functional triggers and by event-based factors. So case tends to be better preserved in Eurasia, right? We see this in the plots. But we also see an effect of the correlation with verb final order, right? So there is something to that as well. And these two things evidently in Eurasia interacted in a way to make case marking going together with OV order very popular in Eurasia, but less so in other parts of the world. Okay? So this is the family bias method. Now, why am I talking about case marking in word order in a summer school about lexical typology? Because it's a very good example of a way of directly targeting, or I don't know, are there languages that have something in between directly and indirectly? Because I would like to have indirectly, I don't know, meso-directly, let's say. This is a kind of meso-direct way of targeting the role of language contact. Why? Because it's looking at areal effects. Now, this is not directly targeting language contact. We'll see what that might be shortly. So, okay. And the third family of approaches, so we have the classical Greenbergian approach, which is to try to get rid of language contact because it's a confound if we're looking for universals. The second one is to target the effects of language contact by looking at areality. And the third is by really studying it directly in a typological way. So I'm going to talk about some examples. One is this 2007 book edited by Matras and Sakel called Grammatical Borrowing in Cross-Linguistic Perspective. This is very, very typical of one way of doing typology, right? So we see different ways of doing it, right? One person can make a database, typically for their PhD, and then they have this big database that they continue to work on for parts of their career. These tend to be very comprehensive. Another way of saying, hey guys, I'm interested in something. I'm interested in the linguistics of temperature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take lots of language experts. I'm going to try to make it as scattered across the globe as possible and to have a good mix of big majority languages with interesting, funky minority languages spoken in little holes in different parts of the world. And then I'm going to write an introductory chapter which generalizes over the contributions. Now, this is a good way of, I forget how you call this, a sketch or a probe. Actually, this is a super important way of working for typologists. It's not always possible to say, hey, I'm going to make a database, this is years of construction, or it could be. Although, at the end, if we get there, I'll suggest that it's not that complicated, and you can do it too. Right. So, another remarkable example is the World Loanword database, which is freely available not only online, they also publish the results, but you can also download the data. I think tomorrow we'll see one way of using these data that's a little bit different from what the authors did. right? So this is a massive project which basically aims to study whether there are cross-linguistic constraints on borrowability in the, let's say, the lexical domain, or what we'll call later matter replication or something like this. Really fantastic results. In some cases it confirmed what we already knew based on these probes. In other cases it changed what we knew. A fundamental difference since this has been these basic vocabulary lists, like Swadesh type lists. Another example also associated with the Max Planck in Leipzig is the Atlas of Pidgin and Creole structures, another phenomenal resource. A third one, which is smaller in scale but also much more focused, is Frank Seifelt's worldwide affix borrowing survey, right? So it's, I think, 100 language pairs, hundreds of affixes, and so on. We'll see why this is interesting afterwards. A fourth is my database of adposition borrowing. We'll be talking about adposition borrowing more tomorrow, but this is not yet finished and it's not yet online, just to show. But what these studies have in common is, unlike the previous two approaches, what they try to do is to directly study language contact induced change from a typological perspective, right? And also to, as typologists want, to make generalizations. I mean, look, even though we're in this, some of us are in this mood of distributional typology and diversity linguistics, I think no one is suggesting that we're trying to make typology into an ad hoc affair. No one is saying we just want to say, look how cool this is. I mean, it's nice to find cool, rare things, but we are looking for generalizations. Yeah? So just a little bit more background. I imagine that most of you know these things, so I'll do it quickly. Just a common terminological issue is that we often talk about borrowing, but people have repeatedly said that this is actually a kind of a silly metaphor because it's not always the case that you give it back, and typically borrowing involves giving it back. Of course, this does happen. If you look at the history of English and French, for example, we see actual literal borrowing, where the English speakers took a word for a little while, they gave it back to the French, and not only in terms of the actual matter of the word, which is a distinction we'll make in a moment, but also in terms of polysemy networks. I remember reading this in a paper by Matisov about changes that have been happening in French origin words under the influence of English polysemy patterns. So the distinction I would like to make here is between what Matras and Sakil called matter and pattern replication. Is there someone who this is new to? Because otherwise we can skip it. Right, it's new. Okay, good. So matter replication is when I take the actual substance, the phonological substance of something, together with some aspect of its meaning. So if I say that the word balagan is a loan word, it's because I took also the phonological substance and also some aspect of its meaning. As opposed to matter replication, which is just taking some sort of organizational principle of the word. So this could be a syntactic pattern, it could be some fact of distribution, some fact of the ability of an element to combine with something else. It could also be frequency, which is a big issue, right? So we might have some sort of pattern that's already existing in language A, but because of contact with another language, its token frequency rises or its type frequency rises. All right, so this is a distinction made. Lars Johansen also used other terms which people have not really followed, but they're very good actually, and in some senses they're better, which he called things global copying, so you're copying the whole sign, it's a more sign-based approach, as opposed to selective copying, which is just copying some aspect of something, right? Now, it's important to mention this in the context of lexical borrowing because obviously this is orthogonal. It's not the same to the distinction between lexical and grammatical borrowing. So if we look at Matras and Sakil's book on grammatical borrowing, this also involves the borrowing of things like adpositions, conjunctions, but also, let's say, sounds and syntactic patterns and so on, right? So we actually need something that distinguishes between copying something including its sound structure and some aspect of its structure. Also, and this is an issue that's not widely taken up except in phonology, actually any kind of loan word or loaned item has to be integrated somehow into the target language's structure. And this is actually a fascinating domain. We'll talk about this more tomorrow and a bit today as well. So lexical borrowings are never naked from grammar anyway. They also have their own grammar, right, in the donor language. Plus, and I imagine that Masha will talk about this more, lexical items can drag along different chunks of their meaning, right? It doesn't always have to be that if you have one word in a language and it's borrowed, you copy the entire polysemy network, right? Sometimes you get only chunks, and then an open question is whether, for example, in the context of semantic maps, you always have to borrow contiguous chunks or not, but we leave this for later. Well, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, that is. Okay. I also want to mention something about hierarchies, what have been called borrowing hierarchies or scales. That's ugly. I think most of you have seen this, maybe some of you haven't, but if you look at these from the point of view, with the eyes of a typologist, what do they mean to you? I mean, if you look at the first one, right? So content item, arrow, function word, arrow, agglutinating accents, arrow. What does this mean? How do we interpret this? What do you think?
Well, this is a scale of grammaticalization.
Oh, yeah, but in the context of borrowability, it's not, but but of course what you say is relevant. I mean, probably what people would like to think if they're thinking of causes is that grammatical material, or let's say matter replication of grammatical material goes according to the scale. This might have something to do with the degree of integration within paradigmatic systems or whatever, but here we're already at speculating about causes. I'm just talking about something much more trivial. How do we read this? What does it mean when you see these scales?
The things that are left are more prone to borrowing.
Right, so this is the basic idea, that they're more prone to be borrowed, but what does that also mean? And how would that play out, and how would we know? So it's been pointed out that these have very different readings. One is quantitative, right? When you say more prone, it might be that we just find more nouns being borrowed than pronouns, right? So, and that's not a trivial observation if it's true, which it is. Temporal readings, right? In a given language context situation, we would expect nouns to be borrowed before pronouns, right? So this is a claim about history. Implicational readings, which is you can't borrow something to the right if you haven't already borrowed something to the left. Now this is similar to temporal readings, but it's not exactly the same because, for example, you can think of a language borrowing something from the left and then losing it, and then, how would this show up in our implicational universal? And then frequency, right? They're more frequently borrowed. So not that you have more borrowed nouns in a given situation than conjunctions, but rather that it's more frequently the case that nouns are borrowed. Of course, all of these things are not mutually exclusive, but they're just different ways of reading them. Now, something to be said about borrowing hierarchies is that we have to be very careful about them because, first of all, they're probably epiphenomena. It means that they're not some kind of explanatory principle in their own right, but the result of something else that's going on. So the very fact that we have a hierarchy isn't an explanation, and we have to be careful about this because sometimes they are used as explanations. Right? We won't go into this now. Right, so this, and then the other issue is that very few of them are actually based on any kind of extensive cross-linguistic samples. So again, these are ideas based on probes. Some of them have turned out to be good based on cross-linguistic samples, but as I'll say later, we don't really have so many big cross-linguistic samples that we could actually based on. Okay, some hierarchies, maybe the most famous one is the one proposed by Thomason and Kaufman in their 1986 book, which is what made me want to be a contact linguist when I read it. So they have a hierarchy that says, okay, the first category is content words, and then function words, and then little phonological features, and then afterwards things like adpositions, and finally, big typological changes. The reason why I separated this from the other is that it already builds into the hierarchy the causal factor, and that's on the left. And they say that basically it goes from casual contact to intensive contact. But what does it mean to be casually in contact or intensively in contact? We can probably break this down into more primitive notions involving the degree and extent of bilingualism in a community and dominance relationships and other things. We'll see more of this later. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the beginning of Greenbergian typology's occupation with language context from a different point of view. This is an article that I think that most linguists, certainly most typologists, should read by Edith Moravcsik, called Language Contact. It's in the volumes edited by Greenberg himself and others, and Edith Moravcsik took upon herself to write an article about universals of language contact. And this is very brave because at the time there was very little research on language contact. There were a few books, but I mean really not too much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through 7 universals that she proposed, show you how they reflect the Greenbergian way of thinking about things, and then I'm going to show you some empirical case studies evaluating these universals. So that's what we're doing for the next few moments. So it's not always easy to read Moravcik's writing. It's a little bit technical in this way that Greenberg's colleagues like to write. So no non-lexical property can be borrowed unless the borrower already includes borrowed lexical items from the same source language. So that's a bit complicated. I translated it for you. Grammatical morphemes are not borrowed until after some lexical morphemes have been borrowed first. Now what's interesting about this is that this is a Greenbergian, I gave them the names by the way, and also I made these tetrachoric tables for you. But this is a really classical Greenbergian universal, implicational universal, right? Because it allows for languages that borrowed both grammatical and lexical material, or only lexical but not grammatical material. Neither lexical nor grammatical material, it doesn't counter-predict these, but it excludes languages that have borrowed grammatical material but not lexical material, right? So this is great because this is a hypothesis about what's a possible kind of language and what isn't, right? And so we can, as typologists, we can take it upon ourselves to see if this is in fact the case. Now, what I'm going to suggest in the following is that these probes, these ideas that Moravcsik had, she didn't build any kind of sample. It was based purely on languages that she had some acquaintance with or had good grammars of. And much of the article deals with anecdotal things. But nonetheless, what usually turns out to be the case is that there's something really true about the core idea, whereas it's not completely true. Moreover, when we do typology, then we learn a lot more than we thought we would along the way. Right? So these are kind of the takeaway messages. Indirect bound morpheme borrowing. I'm not going to read you Moravcik's phrasing because it's complicated. What she basically says is that it's excluded cases where language will directly borrow affixes. Right? The idea being that first you borrow whole words, so kitchenette or profitable, and then afterwards this becomes analyzable within the target language, and this affix can be applied to lexical items from the native stock. This is the idea. It actually goes back to Hermann Powell, who said it very clearly, but this is the idea that you shouldn't have direct borrowing of bound morphemes. So again, this is a Greenbergian universal actually, right? Because it allows for borrowing of bound and free items, only free but not bound, neither free nor bound, but it excludes languages of the type that have borrowed bound items but not free ones, right? Nouns first, another universal. So it's complicated, but basically it says nouns are always the first thing to be borrowed, and this excludes languages that do something else. A universal proposed by Moravcsik, which spurred an immense amount of research, is the idea that verbs are not borrowed as verbs. So they have to be verbalized in some way. The idea being that you can't take a verb and just plunk it into a target language. You have to do something. You have to derive it in some way. Derivation before inflection. So derivational stuff is borrowed before inflectional stuff. Again, phrased as universal. It rules out cases in which inflectional material is borrowed without derivational material having been borrowed. Right? And linear order preservation. We're going to talk about this a lot tomorrow, so I'm going to say something about this. It basically says that you can't borrow a grammatical item without dragging along its typical linear order. So if you have a preposition, you have to borrow it as a preposition and not a postposition, never mind what the basic word order of a language is, right? So let's say you want to borrow a Persian preposition into a postpositional Turkic language. This universal predicts that the preposition is going to end up as a preposition. This is very interesting, and actually one of the universals that's really not grounded in common sense. And there's something not trivial about this. Right, so this would exclude, of course, cases in which, let's say, a preposition was borrowed as a postposition. And I know that a lot of you guys, at least the Moscow guys, do field work in very SOV language areas, right? Like all of the Uralic places and so on. So you probably won't have too many opportunities to check out if this is true, because when Chuvash is borrowing from Mali, I don't think you have so many opportunities to evaluate this, but maybe in the Caucasus or other places. Okay, and we're going to skip this, never mind. Now, the thing about universals is that it's very hard to find universals, and every universal is very hard won. It usually involves a lot of work, and one of the problems with universals is that once you have one, people are going to defend it. And this is not really so great for science, but it's just something to be said. The other thing is that in Greenbergian typology, usually explanations have tended to be language internal, right? So you can think of Dreyer's branching direction, explanation for word order correlations, and so on. But as we've seen, and probably as every linguist knows, explanations for why language properties or language structures are distributed in the world's languages the way that they are, it's likely to be both historical and complex, right? And probably very simple explanations of this sort are unlikely to be the full story. So we're going to look at 3 case studies. 2 we're going to look at today, if we manage, and the other one is going to be left for tomorrow. One, we're going to look at Moravcik's no verbs idea. We're going to look at the indirect bound morpheme borrowing principle, and we're going to look rather extensively tomorrow at the linear order preservation principle. So the first one, of course, some of you will know this. It's Jan Wohlgemuth's book, a typology of verbal borrowings. It's, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the first PhD, which conducts a large-scale typological study of some aspect of lexical borrowing or matter replication. It directly responds to Moravcik's idea that verbs are not borrowed as verbs, but have to be somehow derived as verbs within the target language, and so on. So, you know what, because we talked about sampling earlier, I'd like to say something about sampling in this context. When you directly target language contact-induced change from a typological perspective, it's often the case that you can't afford to make a nicely balanced sample. In some cases, presumably you could. So let's say you're interested in whether a language has borrowed a phoneme from another language or not. Probably you can make a sample of 300 languages, and it will take you a few hours or a few days to go through the phonology sections of grammars, and you probably have a lot of data points either way. On the other hand, if you're looking at something like borrowed adpositions, which is something that concerns me, or borrowed pronouns, if you make a random sample or a balanced sample, you're simply not going to have enough data points. So what's characteristic of this type of work is massive convenience samples, basically. Anything you can get your hands on, because also for borrowing, it's not just a question of whether a language has an antipassive or not, but you really have to know a lot about the history, and for this you need language experts. So I'm not aware of any cases in which people have tried to make random or balanced or stratified samples in order to target language contact, and it's probably not a good idea. Rather, what would be a better idea is to make dense samples of small areas would be even preferable to trying to make a balanced sample. Anyway, this is what Jan Wohlgemuth did. It was definitely in everything he could get his hands on sample, with hundreds of languages being involved. And his main findings are that verbs can definitely be borrowed as verbs. Not only this, but there's a relatively limited range of ways of integrating a verb into a target language. One of them is direct insertion of a verbal stem. We'll see this. Another one is deriving it using some kind of verbalizer. A third one is using light verbs. So he looked quite extensively at how you say to click on something, in a variety of modern languages, right? So you can either, I don't know, how do you do this in Russian, for example? Do you put it directly into a verbal morphology? And you have to use this ovach thing? Click ovach something? Okay, right, so this would be an example of indirect insertion. You use something you would usually use for denominal verbs, but in many languages you would just say to make a click. That's what you do in Hebrew, or one of the things you can do in Hebrew. I think also in Greek it's one of the options. And then the final thing is paradigm transfer, which is really taking a verb with its entire morphology. And this also happens, and this was really unexpected. So let's just take a look. In Coptic, this thing, which maybe you can see, this is a light verb. It incorporates, right? So indirect insertion, this is already examples from Moravcik's original paper. So you have to use a verbalizer when you borrow a verb. On the other hand, in Quechua, you just take the stem, you get rid of the infinitive marker you take the stem, you just chuck it into the verbal morphology, no problem. And paradigm transfer, which is where you really copy an entire verb with all of its morphology. In this case, this is a variety of Romani, which took Turkic or Turkish verbs, and you can, for those of you who care to look at the glosses, you can see that they have bound person markers and everything. This is the part of the talk where I say I don't want to argue about whether this is code switching or not. Okay? Yeah. So they think that it's not. They think that it's not because this is the way that you do it, right? So this is like a really borrowed verb. It's freely used and it doesn't show any other signs. But I'm not the one to argue about it. So some side effects of this, because his point was not just to say Moravcsik was wrong, which is a completely uninteresting thing for linguists to want to say, but rather there's a hierarchy of borrowing strategies. So he imagines this as kind of, imagine the amount of mechanics or effort that you have to expend in order to treat a borrowed verb as a native verb. So the easiest, the least amount of mechanics would be direct insertion. Just treat a verb like any other verb in the language, followed by indirect insertion. You verbalize it some way, maybe it's treated just like other denominal verbs. And the most amount of effort is saying, hey, this isn't really good for being a verb, I'm going to use it as the complement of a light verb, right? And then paradigm insertion is kind of not really on this scale. Now, there are many things that turned out to be relevant to this scale. So, for example, in many cases of language change, we can see that something begins with a light verb strategy, like a given loan verb, and then it's integrated more deeply, it's treated more as a native verb, and in the end it can be used just in a direct insertion. So this has relevance for diachrony. Also, languages that have multiple strategies for integrating loan verbs, they tend to have contiguous ones on the scale. So direct insertion goes with indirect insertion goes with light verbs, and so on. But we also turned up some evidently non-trivial statistical universals. For example, languages that put dependents before heads tend to use light verbs, the light verb strategy. Conversely, languages that put heads before dependents tend to use direct insertion. Now, because you guys are all typologists and you come from this part of Eurasia, I mean, well, some of you do at least, this might also raise questions, this kind of universal, right? Because linear order tends to pattern aerially due to inheritance or contact or both. So maybe this head-dependent thing is just the result of history. Maybe it's a proxy for something else going on. We don't know yet. I mean, this is really just descriptive statistics. But other things, so if a language uses two accommodation strategies, one of them is almost always going to be direct insertion. That's an interesting result. That's not trivial. It wasn't predictable just from common sense. Okay. Now, if we look at the global picture, that doesn't tell us anything, so I'll break it down. This is direct insertion. You see it pretty much all over the world. This is indirect insertions. Here you see more aerial clustering. This is light verbs. Again, aerial clustering. You see where this is popular. And paradigm insertion, we can use the small map because it's only found in the Eastern Mediterranean. So if you look at it a bit more closely and not just as points on maps, we can see that direct insertion, you can find it everywhere in the world, but it's really prominent in some places in the world. And the same thing goes for indirect insertion. You can find it everywhere, but it's very common in Eurasia, especially Western Eurasia. The light verb strategy is very prominent in Australia, and paradigm insertion, as we said, is very geographically limited. So maybe this very possibility is bound to very particular socio-historical events. So the bottom line is that verbs definitely can be borrowed as verbs, unlike what Moravcsik thought. But we found lots of other interesting stuff along the way. So we found patterns of co-occurrence of verb accommodation strategies. Other things came up as well. But in today's context, we see an aerial effect. We see an aerial effect of the way that verbs are borrowed. Now, this is suggestive, right? This raises questions. We'll talk about this a bit more at the end. Now, the next universal that I wanted to talk about, and we'll do this briefly, is the indirect bound morpheme one, right? It says you don't borrow bound morphemes just like that. You have to borrow a whole lexical item, and then it's later reanalyzed. So Frank Seifert, on the basis of his database, wrote a very nice article 2 years ago in which he talks about direct and indirect affix borrowing, right? So indirect borrowing, this is the way that Moravcsik thought things should work, is first the language borrows some complex loanwords, and then, possibly much later, these complex loanwords come to be analyzed within the recipient language, and eventually the affix becomes productively used on native stems. And this is the example of able, which comes able, able in English, which comes from French, so profitable, honorable. I have no idea how these were pronounced in Middle French. They're complex. In English, they were taken over as whole loanwords. And then afterwards, they spread to native stock stems like knowable, speakable, and so on, right? That's the idea of indirect insertion, borrowing, sorry. Direct borrowing, it doesn't work like this. You just take an affix and stick it on a native stem in your own language. So there's no intermediate phases. We're not talking about a complex historical story and so on. And there's actually not bad evidence for this. So he was looking at Bora classifiers, which are suffixes, that are borrowed into the Sigaro, another language, as such, without any lexical borrowing, without any borrowing of complex loanwords, right? He set up some criteria for how you can identify it because it's not trivial and it's not easy. And he found lots of evidence for this in languages across the world. Actually, most of them tend to be derivational. Few of them, if any, are inflectional, which also is suggestive, right? So we find classifiers, we find kind of boring derivational morphemes, and so on. Also, some cases of indirect borrowing, right? Anyway, and an interesting thing is that it turns out that if an affix does attach directly to a closed class of stem, like numerals or pronouns, which actually turned out to be quite prominent in the sample, it's likely to be directly borrowed, right? Because actually you don't really borrow pronouns that often, right? Or question words or something like this. So actually the chances of these kind of affixes getting into a language via indirect borrowing is kind of slim. Also, there seem to be many languages which have cultural inhibitions against lexical borrowing. This is very prominent, it seems, in North America, which is why if you look at any database of borrowing, you're going to see a big hole where North America is. Possibly it has to do with the way that these languages have been described. Possibly it reflects the state of our knowledge of lexical borrowing in North America. But something that's very frequently reported is taboos against borrowing lexical items. Interestingly, these may not apply to affixes, right? This is Seifert's idea, right? So, the summary for today is that we've seen three approaches to contact-induced change within typology. One is sample it away. The second is target it more or less directly, what I call meso-directly, I guess. You identify aerial effects, but this is not really directly targeting language contact-induced change, but you can also target it directly by making samples of various sorts. Right? I mentioned this issue of what's, where, why, and we've been talking about linguistic properties, but an extremely important question that's going to come up, and I think it's going to come up in the context of this summer school in different ways, is what if it's not only that linguistic properties are distributed unevenly in the world's languages, but what if types of change are distributed unevenly in the world's languages? Could it be possible that we find in Eurasia that we like metaphors, but in South America we like metonymy as a motivation for semantic change? And just say, could it be that we think that an intervocalic lenition is completely natural, but it turns out to be a fact of Western Eurasia, and so on? We can ask these kind of questions, which means that we can also really directly target, from a typological point of view, types of change, taking into account where they are found, where they were prominent, and so on. So some avenues for future research, and this is the part where I really would like to invite you to a party, right? Because language contact research from a typological perspective is really fun. It's very challenging. Almost nothing has been done yet. So unlike, yet another book about the typology of, word order, you can do something that's just never been done before. So what we have is some stuff about verb borrowing, adposition borrowing, affix borrowing, loanwords in general, which, believe me, is a massive undertaking, and a few others, but that's really it. We don't know anything about the typology of contact-induced sound change for the phonologists among you. For the syntax, I started making a database. If you guys would like to participate, you're welcome. I wanted to say that you can sometimes think that making a database is a big, complicated thing, but since we live in the 21st century, you can just make a Google form in order to make a preliminary kind of database. It's very adaptable, it's easy, and you don't have to sweat it. Also, everyone thinks that word order is very impacted by language contact, but actually we don't know nearly anything about this. Almost everything is completely anecdotal. We don't know in what situations word order is or isn't affected by language contact. So this would be an amazing PhD if any of you are interested. And because some of you are also field linguists, I wanted to say that a very accessible way into this field is making small, dense aerial typologies, right? So I made, together with Dmitry Nikolaev, we made a small typology of sound systems in Greater Kurdistan. So these are languages that we can get along with, we know where the material is found, and so on. And this is also a contribution, because once we have a lot of aerial typologies, then we'll have a better idea of what's going on in the world, right? Anyway, so nearly everything remains to be done in this domain. This is, once again, an open invitation to all of you. For the next 2 meetings, I'll be telling you more about work that some people have done and that I've done in this domain, but really the work that's going to be done is going to be done by you guys. So that's it for now. And that's it. We still... I don't know if we have time for questions. Yeah?
Can you return to the story about borrowing of verbs?
About borrowed verbs, yeah.
And light verbs
Yeah.
And verbalizers.
Yeah.
So,
how do you distinguish?
has she, a bit further to the map, has she checked whether these strategies, in particular light verb strategy and indirect borrowing, depend on what grammatical categories this language already has? Because this frequency of light verb borrowing in Australia, it seems a bit suspicious. Maybe it's just because these languages already have light verbs, and some languages don't use light verbs in such a frequent way, but use verbalizers. So has she checked it?
Yeah, to an extent, some properties, yes. So word order, alignment patterns. I don't know if Wolfgang would check, I don't know, the frequency of use of light verbs in particular for this.
She, in some languages, maybe verbalizers aren't present, and so direct borrowing is impossible in these languages.
Yes, I mean this is possible, of course. That if a language doesn't have, although it should be said that in some cases languages borrow verb accommodation strategies. So it's known again in Meso-America that languages, I think if I'm not mistaken, it's between Nahuatl and another language from the area, that actually a language borrowed a particular morpheme for integrating loan verbs. So yeah, like in language, also in language contact, everything is possible, but we're still looking for generalizations. I'm sorry, could you also say your names? Because could you say your name?
Ilya.
Ilya.
I have a question about the part where you show the historical, so how to
Yeah.
Borrowing, so which language family is prone to something, and I didn't quite get it. So this for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't quite get. Do you control for these historical events? Do you try to control the content itself, or it's not the case?
No.
It's not important.
The way that Bickel does it, which is a way that's actually easy to implement, he's completely agnostic about the sources of family biases. So he doesn't care. It could be just a fashion, it could be some kind of superior drift, it could be contact, he doesn't care. He's just trying to find out if a given family has a bias towards gaining something, losing it, or no bias at all, which is a possible criticism of this.
Yeah, I just don't get it. If we don't control the context, so how can we say that it's a family that's like a generic case, not just, for example, context like a case with the Romanic languages,
Yeah.
with this Latin influence. So I don't understand why it's unimportant.
It's not unimportant. What I said is that Bickel is agnostic about this particular chunk of this. There's another chunk of what he does, which is predictive, he calls it predictive areal theory, in which, unlike most area linguistics, which have looked at features in a particular area and then argued about how many features you need, and is this really an area, and so on, what he says is we're going to take predefined areas that are based on what we know about patterns of human settlement and migration and contact, and we're going to take these as the fixed thing and then see what properties come up. So I would say that for Bickel, he tackles the specific issues of contact with a different part of his toolkit, and not within family bias method. This is just to see whether a given family has, of course you're going to see this, right? So a family, let's say Indo-European, is very often going to show areal splits, right? I mean, so something we'll talk about on the third day of the course, which is causative alternations and related things. Then what we're going to see there is that in some of these big spread out families, we're going to see very clear areal effects, and you can control for it. I mean, this is just one way of doing it. It's actually not so easy to implement areality when doing statistics, because actually languages are spoken over areas, and linguists tend to talk about them as points. And so, like, some people have tried different ways of getting a continuous variableness, so using, let's say, longitude or something like this. This doesn't work out because, you know, there's also lots of northwest splits and so on. But yeah, it's an issue. And if you like, I think there's a possibility of putting articles online on the website. So I'm happy to put up all of the articles that we discussed today. I simply didn't manage to do it before I came.
You mentioned your database in construction.
Yeah.
Is there a way to look at it?
Yeah, well, this is super embarrassing, but I'm happy to share this with you actually, because it's a good instance of what not to do. When I began to build this database, I said, I don't know anything about databases. People told me you have relational databases and you have this and you have that, and I'm a little bit of a technophobe, so I hired some IT guy to build me a database, and I put all the stuff, and it's very nice, and you can have a screenshot and so on, and this guy evaporated, this IT guy, and so I have really no idea like what's going on within in Yiddish we would say kishkes, the guts of this thing. So the short answer is yes, but I have to basically get access to it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But tell us a little more about the concept.
So I'm going to talk about this a lot tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
So, but really I want to also, because it's a summer school, I'm going to talk about how to build the database and what's in and what's out and how you define things and so on, right? And then we'll talk about some of the results. But yeah, basically, I mean, also had most of it also in spreadsheets, so I'm happy to pass this around. That's the other thing, like, why do I like to use Google Forms? Or Google Sheets rather, I'm sorry, because it's super easy and like it's rarely corrupted. You can download it into Excel, and it's a very good way to begin things, because usually when you begin a database, you don't realize everything that you'll have to take into account. So if you build it in a very rigid way, then you're going to basically screw yourself in the following chapters of your database. So it's really good to start it with a very flexible, low-tech way, in my view, and only really afterwards put it into something high-tech and pretty. That's my experience, at least. Plus, one of the nice things about these kind of online databases is that it's very easy to invite collaborators, right? Which is not always the case when you have a data, like a more complicated database. So, right. But yeah, we'll talk about this tomorrow at length. Okay. I'm sure we have to finish then.